The phone vibrated on a stainless steel cart at 0312 in a nondescript hotel laundry room. A woman lifted it with damp hands, wiped lint from the screen, answered, whispered 3 syllables, and set the phone back into a pile of freshly folded sheets. Beyond the door, the corridor light hummed and a faucet dripped somewhere near the service elevators. For the guests above, the staff were invisible, a blur that passed in the night. For one intelligence unit across a border, that whisper was a thread that led into a pattern. The voice on the call belonged to Yossi Amram, not the well-known operative in historical files, but a cleaner, whose job required him to enter rooms, touch surfaces, and memorize the small routines of strangers. What he did not know was that his shift times, the way he folded towels, and the cadence of his cough had already been catalogued by eyes over the Mediterranean sky and by listenings that turned human noise into signals intelligence. Over the next 48 hours, a chain of people and machines would transform a hotel cleaning crew into an asset network that reached across 3 countries. This is not a spy thriller with sudden gunfire on a rooftop. It is a reconstruction of choices made in windowless rooms, of software that matched footprints to faces, of a deepfake voice used to open trust, and of political calculus that decided what to do with people who did not know they were valuable. We will show how technical capability met moral calculation, how a routine cleaning shift became the hinge for an operation that asked an old question in a new register. What does it mean to be useful to a state that treats human beings like instruments? We will rebuild the hours that turned a crew into a network and examine the cost. Yossi was born in a seaside town, where the smell of fish and diesel coated the mornings. As a child, he learned to recognize the names of ships by the way their horns rolled across the harbor. He left school at 16 to help his family, apprenticed as a linen presser, and learned the unspoken rules of service work. Do not stare, do not ask, and always return the key to the same place. He trained himself to notice what guests left behind, not to steal, but to catalog small comforts so the hotel could stock exactly what its most discreet patrons expected. Later, a scholarship put him into a vocational program where he learned basic maintenance and a bit of English. The first real loss came when his brother fell from a construction scaffold, and the family had to sell the tiny home they had built together. That event hardened a patient sort of pragmatism in him. He married, had a daughter, and took night shifts that let him be home in the mornings. His present life was organized around routines and favors. He belonged to a cohort of service workers who traveled between cities, whose social capital lived in knowing linen suppliers, the routes for cheap diesel, and the managers who could bend the rules for a trusted hand. To neighbors he was reliable and small. To others he became a node. The man who could enter rooms without raising suspicion, who could collect postcards from rooms and notice the placement of phones, chargers, and power adapters. His history was not heroic. It was the kind of human detail that intelligence operations find useful when they want behavior to be predictable. In a way, this backstory is the most ordinary part of the story. It explains why he was susceptible to offers that promise stability, to small increases in pay, to the idea that working for someone who called in the late hours was simply another job order. His childhood loss gave him an ability to stay calm when plans changed. His training with linen and leaks made him procedural in thought. His present was a calculus of survival, folded into the texture of towels. The transformation that moved Yossi from cleaner to covert asset did not happen overnight. It began with observation, then with invitation, and finally with training that was technical and psychological. Early on, a case officer named Rivka Cohen began to chart service workers across a set of hotels located along a corridor of diplomatic travel. Rivka watched shift logs, payroll anomalies, and hard-to-explain gratuities. She and an analyst named Daniel Petrov cataloged schedules and noted that certain cleaners worked late and entered suites with relative impunity. A mentor figure in this story was Colonel Avi Levy, who had supervised a previous generation of assets and who taught a patient doctrine: Small gains often produce strategic outcomes. Training included basic signal handling, a vocabulary for giving and receiving information, and rehearsal of cover stories. That training was both manual and intangible. Yossi learned to place folded corners of sheets in a specific pattern that meant nothing to guests but everything to handlers. He learned to flush a sink twice in a way that could be detected by a remote microphone placed in the janitor closet. There was no flashy classroom. Learning occurred in a safe house, where Marcus Vogel, a liaison officer, conducted dry runs with a broken kettle and a map of the city spread on a table. The moral ambiguity was explicit. Some of the training was about ethics and refusal, conversations in which Rivka told him that some orders would be refused and that his consent mattered. Other parts were practical and coercive in tone, small pressures that escalated by degrees. This duality shaped his choice architecture. The technical arc the simple to describe. Human assets were recruited through everyday contact. Signant systems flagged patterns in metadata. Analysts cross-referenced both to propose candidates. That technical chain made recruitment efficient, but the human chain made it durable. The identification process began as a query in a signals database. Analysts in an operations room receiving raw telemetry ran correlations between devices that pinged just Wi-Fi and geolocation traces. A satellite image analyst named Elena Torres noticed repeated night deliveries to the hotel loading bay. A forensics technician named Sarah Ben David ran a metadata extraction on a delivery manifest and found anomalies in vendor codes. The process moved from wide net to focused lens. The SIGINT team provided call detail records and phone usage patterns, while human operatives collected direct observations. The metadata suggested a person who entered different rooms but left a particular pattern behind. In meetings between Rivka, Daniel, and Colonel Levy, they narrowed the possible list to a small set of staff. Verification protocol required cross-checks. They placed a benign technical probe in the hotel elevator shaft not to intercept private conversations, but to capture motion and sound signatures that could be matched with shift logs. The chain of custody for that probe was strict. Each handling was documented, each digital extract hashed and time-stamped to preserve evidentiary integrity. A CCTV analyst compared laundry cart paths and found that a specific cleaner routinely entered VIP floors without a supervisor on the same evenings liaison flights arrived. That was how Yossi moved from a data point to an identified person. The team then faced an ethical fork. Was the goal to disrupt a larger network by using him as an entry point, or to remove him from the field to avoid collateral harm? The political consequences of either choice were clear, and heated arguments followed. The operation that unfolded over 48 hours involved coordination across satellites, telephone analysis, on-the-ground surveillance, and a layer of technical deception. The command center hummed with monitors. A satellite image showed the hotel roof with its cluster of air conditioning units and service vents. An operations officer adjusted a zoom, and the grainy image sharpened into geometry. Outside, in the hotel, the cleaning crew performed the same tasks they always did, with the same chemical smell and the same rubber soles squeaking on tile. That ordinary domestic sensory world was the stage. The operation began at 000 with 3 parallel moves. First, a satellite pass timed to detect unusual rooftop activity while the city slept. Second, SIGINT specialists executed a targeted intercept to capture a single outgoing call from a burner phone the analysts believed connected to a larger cell. Third, human operatives embedded as maintenance contractors to test the patterns in person. The plan required perfect timing and tolerance for delay. In the command room, dialogue went in rapid exchanges. Rivka, we have a hot pattern on this device now. Daniel, can we pull CDRs to the last 72 hours and isolate unique handoffs? Elena, satellite will have a pass in 27 minutes. Marcus, I will be on the east stairwell with a cover story about water pressure. Sarah, forensics can parse any residue in the linen. Avi, do not move until I say move. Yossi in the field adjusted his cart, folded a towel, and saw a small folded receipt lodged behind a lamp. He paused and felt the paper texture, smelled the faint perfume residue, and tucked the receipt into his pocket as he always did. The satellite feed picked up a silhouette on a service balcony. A remote tracker registered a short Bluetooth handshake in a corridor. The SIGINT feed spiked with a voicemail that had been altered by a deepfake voice to mimic a supervisor requesting a room access. The team moved. The hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and warm carpet. The voice on the voicemail had the cadence of the manager, but a slight metallic echo that a trained analyst could detect. The operation combined the concrete with the abstract. A technical description may help. A satellite pass provides a series of images that can be processed to detect movement by comparing pixel changes across frames. That process is computationally heavy but not secret in principle. Signals intelligence captured call detail records and audio samples that were cross-referenced with voice prints. Human confirmation closed the loop by placing a body in a corridor at a given time. Together, these capabilities allowed a remote command to turn a routine slip of paper into a signal that triggered a human action. One extended action moment tested the limits of procedure. For 7 minutes, a surveillance team on the 7th floor watched a man meet with Yossi. The two exchanged words, inaudible from a camera angle, but visible in their gestures. The smell of cigarette smoke lingered as one of them tapped ash into a small tin. The operator in the van narrated. Marcus. He is leaning left now. Rivka. Is the exchange visual or a handoff? Daniel. I have a ping on the second device. Elena. Satellite confirming presence. Sarah. We need a clean excusal to approach. Avi. Wait for the move I authorized. The tension concentrated around the idea that a single misstep could expose active methods. For 500 to 600 characters, the narrative slowed and detailed the precise rhythms of breath, the texture of cloth, and the weight of each tiny decision. The team decided to stage a maintenance call that would allow an embedded operative to intercept the meeting. The staged call had to feel natural. The crafted pretext included a dripping tap, a polite request, and the promise of compensation. The moment resolved with a subtle handoff of a small SIM card and a folded note. The operator described the tactile click which occurred when the card changed hands. The small scrape of fingernails on cardstock, the metal taste of adrenaline for the observer. That minute had consequences. A second moment of tension arrived when the political line had to confirm a request to use a deepfake voice to elicit a response from a target outside the hotel. The legal officer in a glassed room reviewed chain of custody and compliance documents. The forensics lab produced a memo that said the deepfake could be constructed with public samples and would be unlikely to be uniquely attributable in open court. The moral question was whether to use simulated trust to draw a human into action. The exchange of arguments lasted through a cascade of emails and a final verbal confirmation in the operations room. Yossi was called to the staff office on a pretext that a manager wanted a quick word. He smelt coffee and ink and felt a cold floor under his shoes. Inside, a man with a plain voice asked him innocuous questions. The deepfake voice was used on a phone line to back up the claim that a supervisor needed a signature. Yossi complied. The immediate outcome was a data transfer that allowed remote analysts to map a larger pattern of contacts. The second moment lasted about 500 characters in case narrative terms and changed the calculus. In a technical aside, the way the deepfake voice was created is worth a short explanation. Analysts compiled a corpus of short public clips from social media and combined them in a neural synthesis model to produce a short phrase with matching prosody. The generated audio was run through a filter to match room acoustics and then inserted into a timed call. The operation was careful to avoid exposing the model or the raw samples to uncontrolled networks to preserve chain of custody. This explanation gives context without instructing how to replicate the technique. 48 hours compressed into a sequence of moves. Teams rotated coverage. Safehouse protocols were activated, and assets were briefed in low tones. The hotel staff remained unaware of the web that ran through their halls. At one checkpoint, a human asset named Omar Haddad sat in a dim cafe on the block and recorded an argument between two men that corroborated a procurement route. Layla Mansour, a logistics coordinator within the operation, arranged for a delivery truck to arrive at a public loading bay to mask the movement of equipment. Elena and Sarah cross-referenced laptop MAC addresses recovered from a discard bin with vendor manifests. The operation required that every touch be logged. The command room made decisions slowly when politics intruded. At hour 36, a diplomatic cable from a consulate raised concern about potential exposure of foreign nationals. The political team met in a secure channel and debated whether to continue. The choice was binary in effect. Avi advised restraint. Marcus recommended urgency. Rivka argued for extraction. The final call was to move toward containment rather than elimination. In other words, the aim became to sever the network while minimizing public fallout. The arrest and political decision played out not on a single day, but as a sequence of negotiations. The legal and political apparatus weighed options. A delicate balance existed between using the cleaner to gather more evidence and removing him to prevent potential abuse. International relations mattered. A neighboring state had assets with overlapping interests and would view an aggressive move as hostile. The policymakers considered three scenarios. One required extradition of identified operatives to partner agencies. Another required a quiet extraction and change of identity for Yossi and selected crew members. The third proposed a more public disruption designed to set a precedent. That third option risked diplomatic fallout and media exposure. In a conference call that included a ministry official named Elena Barak, a veteran diplomat called for restraint. A junior official advocated for a public milestone. The final decision prioritized safety and plausible deniability. Yossi and three colleagues were moved to a monitored safe house where a medical check addressed their sudden sleep disturbances and a psychologist assessed signs of psychological degradation. Metadata logs showed that the crew had been in contact with a network of regional couriers and there were fears of downstream reprisals. The operation thus became a case study in risk management. Immediate consequences rippled across the hotel and the broader organization the cleaners had touched. Managers adjusted scheduling, instituted stricter verification protocols, and began rotating staff to prevent predictable patterns. A new handbook for service workers was drafted with language about reporting unusual approaches and company protocols for refusing gratuities. The cleaning crew experienced both financial incentives and social suspicion. Some members felt guilty, others offered denials that carried the sound of disbelief. The organization that had used them went into a period of internal audit. Rivka was reassigned to a desk job for a cooling-off period, and Daniel drafted an after-action review that cataloged technical achievements and ethical lacunae. The network the crew had plugged into dissolved in waves. Couriers were detained or shifted to other routes. The human cost included a modest but real degradation of trust among staff members. Legally, the case required careful handling to preserve a chain of custody for evidence that might be used if prosecutions were contemplated. The forensics team kept digital logs and physical samples in sealed evidence bags with detailed manifests. The privacy community noticed. A civil rights advocate published a critique about the use of service workers in intelligence operations, saying that the practice replicated power imbalances. Across allied agencies, there were immediate technical reflections. Analysts presented three capabilities used in this case to policy teams. Satellite imagery can give movement vectors but requires human interpretation. Signals intelligence provides metadata that maps contact patterns but not intent. Human offers context but depends on consent and moral clarity. Together, they produced a capability that was greater than the sum of its parts. Comparative uses were noted. Other countries had employed similar recruitment of low-profile service staff for decades. Some relied more heavily on paid informants, while others used coercion. The ethical debate intensified in internal briefings. A senior analyst asked aloud whether the intelligence gain justified the degradation of the very communities states claimed to protect. That question lingered. Longer-term organizational changes followed. Training manuals were rewritten to include stricter consent. A verification protocol required a second independent check before any deepfake method could be authorized. The operation revealed a gap in oversight structures. It also produced tactical innovation. The use of pretext maintenance requests as cover became a documented technique in internal doctrine, even as officials argued whether it should be codified or retired. For the cleaning crew, the immediate impact was economic and psychological. Yossi received a small stipend to cover relocation costs, but he found himself checking doors at odd hours, feeling watched in ways he could not articulate. The knowledge that his routine had been repurposed and watched produced paranoia that crept into his nights. He avoided phone calls from unknown numbers and began to fold towels differently as an unconscious gesture of control. Moment of tension number 3 centered on a public leak. An online forum posted redacted metadata that hinted at the operation. The intelligence community scrambled to assess damage. The leak amplified the ethical debate externally. Security officers briefed press teams and prepared a statement that emphasized legality and necessity while avoiding operational specifics. The leak forced a decision to accelerate extraction of non-essential local assets. In closed session, officials considered resignations and the risk of judicial scrutiny. The agency involved initiated a review, and several policymakers promised public oversight hearings. The moment was a reminder that secrecy is fragile and that technical gains may produce political liabilities. A technical process worth highlighting is the way metadata was used without invading content. Analysts constructed a behavioral map by correlating timestamps, location pings, and device handoffs. That map enabled predictive modeling that suggested probable meeting points. The description is high-level yet accurate and avoids operational detail. It shows how aggregated signals can create a picture of human networks. The epilogue arrives in staged time points to show consequences and reflection. 1 month later, Yossi sat in a small apartment with a single lamp and a view of an alley. He had a new identity document and a monthly allowance. He visited a community center running a course in basic bookkeeping and tried to learn a new routine. The apartment smelled of old tea and detergent. He spoke to a counselor who asked about nightmares and about trust. The official files showed a partial break in the network, but also acknowledged collateral damage. At 3 months, the staff of the hotel had instituted rotating assignments, mandatory reporting lines, and an anonymous tip line. Some colleagues returned to older routines with a new wariness. Articles in the regional press debated the use of service workers in intelligence work. A policy committee convened and drafted recommendations for clearer oversight and for expanded protections for low-profile workers who might be approached by intelligence services. Internationally, a parallel conversation began about standards for the use of synthetic media in operations. 6 months after the operation, a public report summarized lessons learned. It recommended that any technique involving non-consenting civilians require higher-level authorization and external affirmation. Review. The report also suggested investment in social support for anyone who had served as an asset. Yossi had learned to boil rice in a new way and sometimes hummed the old sea tales. He was cautious and grateful in equal measure. The final public debates were not just about technical capability, but about the moral framework that governs states. In the end, a stainless steel cart in a hotel laundry room did not start a war. It started a conversation about power, about the ways that routine human labor becomes legible to sophisticated surveillance, and about the moral choices behind operational decisions. The operation demonstrated technical skill and bureaucratic practice. It also exposed a fragile set of ethics around consent, compensation, and oversight. States will continue to use signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and HUMANT because the tools work. The question that remains is who will set the limits and who will bear the human cost when those limits are tested. If this story unsettles you, consider subscribing to follow further reconstructions and to join a conversation about oversight, safeguards, and solutions. The machinery of intelligence is made of people and code. How we choose to govern both will shape whose lives are treated as instruments and whose lives are treated as inviolable.